and welcome to Dr. A for Animals, the podcast that gives you reliable answers to your questions about animal health and wellness and useful tools to help you help animals, whether in your own home or out in the wild. Together with expert guests, I'll give you information that is based on scientific research and clinical experience. I'm Dr. Charla Ansorge, a small animal and exotics veterinarian, and I'm so happy to share my love of animals with you. Let's get started. Today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite subjects, wild animals, and the environment around you. We're going to talk about a whole wide range of how animals and humans interact and how to make the best of that. So let's go ahead and start with why we should care so much about the environment around us and the animals that live in it. Of course, they're worth caring about just for their own sake because they are beautiful and wonderful. But there are also some specific effects that animals and nature have on us in our day-to-day life that makes them even more valuable to us. So when we talk about exposure to nature and some of the studies that have been done on nature exposure for people, that covers a very wide range of experiences. So kind of keep that in mind as I talk about some of the research studies that have been done. This can be anything from sitting in your backyard and listening to birds to taking a walk in the woods or climbing a mountain to being near green spaces in an otherwise urban area. So just an urban park kind of situation can count as nature exposure. And that wonderful flexibility means that the benefits of being in nature can be accessed by most people most of the time. If you're stuck in a big city, a lot of the time it can be a little bit harder, but most big cities, thankfully, do have parks that you can get to. So some of the studies that have been done on this have shown reduced stress levels and overall improved mental health in people that have some access or some exposure to natural spaces. So there's a lower prevalence of depression in people that have regular exposure outdoors, improved cognitive function, lower blood pressure, lower risk for cardiovascular disease, increased physical activity because we tend to be walking around, and better sleep, which can be partly from the increased physical activity, but also from the improved mood, better cardiovascular regulation, and that sort of thing. So there was a meta-analysis of 78 studies that were done between 1990 and 2020 looking at nature exposure dose, so the frequency and the duration of exposure to nature. And this was looking specifically at mental health outcomes in adults with mental illness or symptoms of mental illness. And this showed pretty consistently that repeated exposure, even in short periods as little as 10 minutes at a time, leads to the most significant benefit. So one exposure does result in some improvement in mood, decrease in depression and that sort of thing, but repeated regular exposure has more prolonged and more significant benefits. Several studies specifically on exposure to birds or birdsong show positive effects on mental health. There was a study published in Nature of over 1,000 people that had them report in real time through an app on their phone encounters with birds, and then they also answered questions about their mental state and well-being. And the results of this study showed seeing or hearing birds was associated with a statistically significant improvement in mental well-being. And that held true for people with and without a diagnosis of depression. And that study controlled as much as possible for exposure to other aspects of nature to try to target the effects of birds specifically. So being a bird fanatic myself, I really love that this study and some other studies have shown that birds specifically improve our level of joy. I know they do for me. So I just getting outside and hearing birdsong, or even listening to recordings of birdsong if you can't get outdoors, can help to improve mood and reduce symptoms of depression. So that is a wonderful thing. I should just mention, none of these are considered an alternate treatment for depression. If you are diagnosed with depression, struggling with significant depression, you need other treatment, but this exposure to nature, being around birds, hearing birdsong, that sort of thing is a wonderful adjunctive treatment. Or if you have kind of mild, intermittent melancholy, mild depression, that sort of thing that you're not receiving treatment for, that you don't feel that you necessarily need treatment for, you just don't feel great, that's where this kind of exposure to nature on its own may be enough to kind of lift you out of a funk like that. If you have clinically significant depression, of course, you should be seeing a medical professional. But also, get some time outdoors. There are quite a lot of studies out now that over the last couple of decades and more showing that exposure to sunlight, and particularly red and infrared light, is essential for health, really, and regulating our circadian rhythms, promoting vitamin D production. Of course, that's UV light. That is very protective to health. And these exposure to light also improves your sleep as long as you're not being exposed to light at night. We don't want to have light exposure at night because that will interrupt sleep and mess up your melatonin production. So don't be exposed to light at night. But definitely early morning sunlight exposure and further sunlight exposure throughout the day is incredibly good for you. There are so many wavelengths of light in sunlight, and a lot of those wavelengths are blocked by windows. So sitting in a sunny window isn't adequate, unfortunately. You need to get outside. Humans evolved in the outdoors, and we are much healthier if we get outdoor exposure. So there's some controversy over wearing sunblock, not wearing sunblock. That's a little bit out of the scope of this particular podcast, but there are lots of other podcasts out there that can go into detail for you on that. I want to focus more on the animals and the nature. So I'm going to talk a little more about what kinds of things we do in nature and how they affect you. So bird watching is a great one and easy to do, and I'm going to talk a little more in detail about that because that is one of my pet activities. Just taking a walk in an urban park, hiking or camping out in the wilderness, gardening, taking your dog, cat, or other creature for a walk. I used to take my birds for walks in I had a little carrier that was clear all the way around and had a little perch in it, and I would put my birds in there and go for walks. I'm still on the fence about whether or not they really enjoyed it, but I thought it was great. I also just hang out on my catio with my birds and my cats when the weather's nice. My cat will hang out there regardless of weather, but I will go out there with them when the weather's nice. So just hanging out outside, getting a little sun, getting fresh air, hearing the birds singing, even just that, even if you're not really doing much else, it's still very good for you. The more we notice nature and the wildlife around us, and the more we treat it with respect and care and reverence, the more we enrich our own well-being. So acting as good stewards for the land and the animals that we share the world with is intrinsically rewarding for us personally. And in a time where habitat destruction is rampant, urban areas are growing all the time, we have increased interactions between displaced wild animals, humans, and our pets. So in this kind of a time, how can we best both enjoy our natural surroundings and care for them? That's what I'm going to spend the rest of this episode talking about. So let's start with birds, because birds are awesome and birds are good for you, especially when they're out in the wild. So birding or bird watching, they mean the same thing. This is an incredibly accessible way to enrich your life and learn more about the animals that you share your near vicinity with. Birds are everywhere, even in very urban environments. Our species variability may be lower in a big city. You may be seeing mostly pigeons and crows and gulls, but they are there and they're still super cool. Pigeons are really quite beautiful birds. They have some cool songs and calls that they do. Crows are amazing animals. They're incredibly smart, and their behaviors are so interesting and rich and varied. It may seem like, it's just another crow, but wow, those are really, really cool birds. So bird watching is so accessible for most people. Now, if you don't have vision, hopefully you still have hearing, and you can enjoy birds by listening to their songs and their calls. So even if you can't see them, you still can enjoy birds and get so much of the benefit of to our mental health from listening to birds and learning to identify birds by song. We all can do if we can hear the song. And of course, if you can't hear the song, and hopefully you can see the beautiful birds and watch what they're doing. So they have a little bit of something for most anyone, which is very nice of them to do. You can do it from pretty much anywhere. I mean, I've been in airports where there are birds flying around inside the airport. Inside the airport, there are little flocks of birds. I've been in so many airports that have had birds inside, and they seem to be living and thriving in the plants and stuff that they have planted around the airport, which I think is awesome. And of course, they're right outside the window too. So, learning about the species of birds around you. Wherever you go, you will see someone you recognize, because there are some species of birds that are just everywhere, or a similar species to the one that is in, where you live. There's a similar species, or maybe the exact same species everywhere around the world. So it's not just an academic exercise, but seeing or hearing birds is good for your mental health. But also, the more that you know about specific types of birds, the more fun it gets to see them. It's like you have friends everywhere. Visiting a new area is just an extra adventure in getting to know a bunch of new friends. Every time I travel, I keep a list of the new bird species I see when I go on a trip. And I always get so excited to see a new bird I've never seen before. Even after all the years of birding that I've done, seeing a new bird, I just go nuts. Seeing birds that are familiar, though, is always this warm, cozy feeling. When I was in my 20s and early 30s, I struggled a lot with depression, and going out on a hike and seeing birds that I knew, I can't even explain how helpful that was for me, because in a time when I was feeling isolated and disconnected, I always had these little guys that were my friends. I always could say, there's this little robin, and I know what he's up to. Like, he's digging for worms. He's doing this stuff. I hear the call. I know who he is. They were always there for me. So birding is, I can attest to the improvement in mental health that being around birds can have. I've experienced it personally. So if you're interested in getting started with birding, all you need is to be able to see or hear, or hopefully both, because that's going to be extra fun, and a bird guide of some kind. So there are lots of books out there that are great bird guides, and the books are nice in that the way that they're organized can also help you learn about different types, like groups of birds, the water birds, wading birds, seabirds, songbirds. They're kind of organized in a way that helps you learn a bit more about the grouping, the families of birds. But there are some really good apps that are so easy to keep with you at all times. So most of us have our phones on us all the time, and having an app available wherever you are. So if you hear a bird, you can go, oh, what is that bird? You see a bird, you can look them up real quick. My favorite app, and no, I don't get any kickbacks from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, but I love the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and they have a wonderful app called Merlin. So it's Merlin Bird ID. And with this app, you can enter information about the bird that you're seeing, and it will bring up a list of birds that it thinks are likely. You also can record sound, and it will pick up the songs of the birds around you and give you IDs on the birds. And it's so cool when you're hearing a whole bunch of birds singing and you're not sure who's who, and you're trying to learn their calls and songs, to just see that list pop up of all these different species that you're actually hearing. And that is just a super cool feature. Now, it doesn't have as much of the songbird info for all over the world. So if you're outside of the North America, it's not going to have all of the songs, but it still has all the birds. So you can get bird packs for all these different areas of the world. And you can load them if you're going on a trip somewhere. You can load the bird pack for that area. I was lucky enough to recently go to New Zealand, so I loaded the New Zealand pack and got all the cool birds that are there, and I was already looking at it before I even got there to see who I might expect to see. So it's a lot of fun and a great way to learn new stuff. Now, if you can, get a pair of binoculars, and you'll see a lot more from further away. And, birds can be so quick that it takes a little bit of getting used to use binoculars if you haven't before, but a little bit of practice and you'll pick it up pretty quick. Binoculars that have an 8x42 or 10x42 configuration are the best for birding. And you can get really expensive, really nice binoculars that can be thousands of dollars, or you can get a relatively inexpensive good one made by Celestron for about $100, and it is perfectly good for most of your birding needs. You can certainly get smaller ones that are less expensive, but as they get a bit under $100, they're not going to have as crisp an image, and they may be a little bit harder to follow a bird that's moving around. So 8x42 or 10x42 is going to be the best for giving you a field of view where you can keep track of a bird that's moving around a little bit, but also get enough magnification that you're seeing a lot of wonderful detail. And the more you see of the feather detail and the color, the more spectacular birds will be for you. Another way to see a lot of birds, of course, is to feed birds in your yard. And that can be an amazing way to get to know them better and see them on a regular basis. And sometimes even manage to ID an individual that you know is the same bird over and over, which is really fun. We have a hummingbird that comes to our bird feeder that has a funky tail feather that makes a weird buzz. And we call her Buzz, and she's there. We have known her for years because she always makes that different sound than all the other hummingbirds, so it's just kind of cool. There's some controversy out there about whether it's good to feed birds or it's bad to feed birds as far as the birds are concerned, but there's very little actual data on this, on whether it's a benefit to the birds or potentially harmful to birds. But if it's done properly, it certainly can be very supportive to birds during times of stress. So winter, in the wake of natural disasters, breeding season when they have a huge demand for energy, in areas with poor habitat, so in more urban areas or areas that have been, that have a lot of clear cutting and that sort of thing going on, bird feeding can be incredibly supportive to the birds. So, it does need to be done properly, though, and there are risks if it's done improperly. So if you choose to feed birds, you do need to be very careful that you are not making things worse for the birds. So poor hygiene of the bird feeders or encouraging overcrowding of birds can lead to spread of disease, and we don't want that. And we don't want our seed or nectar to be going bad and causing disease. So it is super, super important to keep your feeders very clean, to be monitoring for signs that there are sick birds or dying birds in the area, and adjust your practices accordingly if you're seeing anything like that. It's also really important to locate your feeders in a safe area. So if you're putting out feeders, you want to make sure they are at least 10 feet away from any windows, because birds that are feeding that become suddenly startled and they take off, they see a hawk flying overhead or something and they take off suddenly. They don't realize that the glass is glass. They see through it and they will fly right at it. And if they're flying really fast, they can get a horrible head injury, potentially, break the clavicle or the shoulder. Most commonly what we'll see is a head injury and brain trauma from a window strike. So we don't want to encourage window strikes. We want to be super, super careful about that. We also want to be careful about attracting predators to the bird feeders. While this is a more natural situation, the whole sort of buffet of little birds at a feeder can be pretty attractive for other birds who eat birds or other animals who eat birds, like your neighborhood cat. So we do want to also make sure that you're locating the feeder in an area where the birds that are using the feeder have a good field of view, but they also have places that they can access pretty easily to escape a predator if they need to. So you don't want to put it don't put a feeder pole in a bush so that a cat can be hiding in the bush and jump straight up and grab a bird. But you do want to have some kind of tree cover or something nearby that 5 feet away that the birds can fly into quickly and easily if they need to hide, say from a Cooper's hawk that's flying in. So you want to make sure that you're making the feeders safe, as safe as possible for the birds that you are attracting to come and use them. So location of the feeders, that's one of the first important things. Now, hummingbird feeders, you probably can get away with having them a little bit closer to the glass because they for whatever reason, hummingbirds seem a little bit more adept at avoiding glass. But if you do have feeders that are anywhere near your windows, I recommend using collision prevention decals that you can stick on the outside of the window. They're clear, so we don't really notice them too much from inside, but they have ultraviolet in them, so they reflect really brightly to the birds. So just putting those little stickers, or you can also get it as a little liquid that you dot onto your windows, that makes it visible to the birds, so they see this pattern of the ultraviolet light reflecting, and that helps a lot in preventing collisions with windows. So I highly recommend using those little decals on your windows. Even if you don't have feeders nearby your windows, I have really big windows, and so when I first moved into this house, I had a few birds hit the windows. I was horrified. Luckily, they were okay. Sometimes they hit the window, and they're dazed a little bit, but they're otherwise okay, and they managed to fly off. But if you're having birds hitting your windows, using those collision prevention decals is very, very helpful. You do need to put a few of them on the window, and you need to put it on the outside of the window. If you put it on the inside of the window, the glass of the window is going to filter out a lot of the UV that's on the sticker, and then it doesn't work so well. So put it on the outside so that it'll reflect that light, and the birds will see it there. Some other important notes about feeding hummingbirds in particular. For one, you don't need to get any kind of fancy formula that you have to buy, and you definitely want to avoid using something that has food coloring in it. I will say I don't think we have a lot of data on how food coloring actually affects hummingbirds, but we do have some data on it not being good for people. So considering that hummingbirds have a much, much faster metabolism than we do, and it's a bit different than ours, there's a good chance that the food coloring is really not very good for them. All you really need to do as far as the feeding formula is mix 1 part sugar with 4 parts water. And as long as you have healthy drinking water that's coming out of your tap or filtered water, you don't have to boil it either. You just let it sit, mix it really well, let it sit for about 10 minutes so that any chlorine or chloramine that's in your treated water evaporates, and then mix it again really thoroughly so everything is up in suspension. And that's all you have to do. You don't have to boil it or anything unless you're in an area that doesn't have super clean drinking water, then you might want to boil it. But in most cases, that's all you have to do. And then the other thing to keep in mind is during wintertime, if you're in a climate that gets really cold, if it snows or it gets icy, you either want to take your feeders in overnight so they don't freeze, or if it's freezing during the day, you want to keep the hummingbird feeders out if you've got hummingbirds in the area, because they probably are actually really relying on your feeders during the wintertime. So I recommend getting a little feeder heater. You can get those at a lot of the wild bird supply stores. You can find them online, but it's a hummingbird feeder heater, and it just kind of clips onto the base of the feeder. And it basically what it is one of those old incandescent Christmas tree lights that we used to have when if you're my age, you probably had them on your tree as a little kid. So you can also rig your own. You just want to make sure that it's safe and there aren't exposed wires or electrical parts that the birds might actually have contact with. We don't want them to land on a bulb and burn their little feet or anything like that. So the ones that are kind of commercially made are in sort of a little cup, so the bulb is kept away from the birds, but it keeps your feeder from freezing overnight. I also have a little thermostat plug attached to the plug, so it automatically goes on when the temperature drops to a certain point, and keeps the feeder from freezing. And I find my hummingbirds are often just sitting on it. They're just sitting on the slightly warm feeder in the morning and just hanging out there, and it's really, really cute. So they like that a lot. I also recommend avoiding feeders that have metal feeding ports during the wintertime, because the metal can get so cold, their tongue can stick to it. So I have heard of this happening from a couple of people in my area during the winter when it's been very cold. So avoid the metal feeding port. A lot of them are very pretty, but I would recommend that you stick with either glass, ceramic, or some of them are a plastic feeding port, and just make sure that you're keeping them very nice and clean. One of the most important things about maintaining bird feeders is keeping them clean. So you must clean them regularly. So make sure if you're buying bird feeders to get ones that are easy to take apart and fully clean. Don't let them sit full of seed or nectar if it's a hummingbird feeder. or an Oriole feeder. Don't let them sit for too long. So they need to be emptied out and thoroughly cleaned at least once a week. And in the summertime, especially in more damp environments, you probably need to do it at least twice a week. If it gets really hot in the summer and you have hummingbird feeders, you want to clean those 2 to 3 times a week. So ideally, you want to soak them with bleach or vinegar solution, a 1 to 10 solution. So you would do 1 part bleach or vinegar and 9 parts water, and let them soak for about 5 minutes after you have washed off any organic material, and then rinse them very, very thoroughly. So I usually do the soak about once a month, depending on how crowded my feeders are. Now, we've had a couple of eruptions of birds where we have a massive population of birds every few years. And I've got like 100 birds in my backyard all of a sudden. And if that happens, I will soak them every week at least, because I'm concerned about that overcrowding. I also will let the feeders run out, so they're empty for a couple days at a time. I do that regularly because I don't want the birds in my yard to be 100% reliant on my bird feeders. So I do let them run empty and sit empty for a day or two, and then I clean them out and I refill them. I don't do that with my hummingbird feeders in the wintertime because the hummingbirds stay up here and it gets quite cold and can be snowing. Hummingbirds actually really do depend on our feeders during the winter in some areas where it's cold, but they stay through the winter. Those feeders can be life-saving for them. So I do not let my hummingbird feeders go empty during winter. Definitely during summer when there are lots of flowers blooming and they've got insects and all kinds of other fun stuff to eat. But it's so important to keep those feeders clean. Hummingbird feeders can grow mildew in them, and that can be deadly for the birds. So you must empty, thoroughly clean, let them dry before you refill. And seed also, if it's sitting in there, especially if it's rained, if the seed has gotten wet, it will grow mold and mildew in there. It can be toxic to the birds. If you are seeing any sick birds around your feeders, you see potentially birds that have like a cloudy looking eye, that is usually finch conjunctivitis that can be very, very contagious between birds, and it can be deadly to the birds. They can get really sick from that. And that the only sign that you'll see from the outside is this cloudy, gooey looking eye. If you're seeing dead birds in your yard, every once in a while, one little dead bird, it will happen. It's sad to find, but it will happen. But if you see a dead bird and then a week later you see another dead bird, there's probably something going around. I would take down the feeders, thoroughly clean, soak them in bleach, and maybe keep them down for a couple of weeks, especially if you're noticing there's a lot of crowding. If you're getting really large numbers of birds all at one time, that we want to discourage that, because the more crowded it is, the more potential there is for disease to spread. Now, if you know that there's an avian disease outbreak, you definitely want to take down your feeders. You can find out about that on your state natural resources or Fish and Wildlife Department websites. Usually they'll have like a notice up if there's a major avian influenza or exotic Newcastle disease outbreak or something like that. Also, rake or sweep below the feeders. You might need to keep more distance between feeders if you're getting some overcrowding, so they're not all in one place. If you can, spread them out around your yard. The raking and sweeping below the feeders also helps to keep from attracting like rats and mice, which if your feeders are near your house, you probably don't want to attract rats and mice. And you can also get these seed mixes that are low waste seed mixes, so they don't, they have the shells removed and that sort of thing, so there's not as much waste falling out. The birds are basically eating pretty much everything that's in there. I know underneath my feeders is usually really clean because anything that the birds drop, the squirrels and chipmunks will get, so I don't have to rake too much, which is pretty nice. But you do want to keep those areas as clean as you can. And if there's a lot of bird droppings going on, you want to kind of rake that stuff up too, at least once a week. Keep that stuff clean. Be sure that you're using species appropriate foods. So if you have an idea of what kind of birds are in your area and or what kind of birds you want to attract, a lot of times at the store you can ask for advice on what's the best mix or seed mix to get or the best type of seed. Keep in mind that really cheap seed often has a lot of low quality stuff in it. The birds might eat it, but it's not so great for them. And oftentimes too, there's filler stuff in there that's super cheap seed that the birds actually won't even eat. So if you're finding there's a lot of leftover seed of like one type out of a mix, they're not eating that, and you're probably not really getting much bang for your buck. So some of the higher quality seed mixes probably are a bit more expensive, but the birds are actually going to eat them and benefit from them more. So I do recommend get the best quality that you can afford to get if you're going to be bird feeding. And you're going to usually find those more at like a Wild Birds Unlimited or a similar kind of store to that versus getting it like at the hardware store or something where you're going to get probably kind of a cheaper seed mix. You can also find that stuff online. You can find some good quality seed mixes. And feeding birds can, if you get really obsessive about it, it can become expensive. So watch out for that. The bird feeding habit, it can kind of hit you in the wallet if you let yourself be taken in too much. But the best quality you can afford is the quality that you should get. And it is okay to let your feeders run out. And in fact, like I said, I actually recommend letting the feeders run out unless it's a period of time that is higher stress. So, during breeding season, there are lots of babies coming to the feeder. During that time, I try to not let my feeders run out. Or when it's snowing out and I know it's harder for the birds to find food, I try to not let them run out during a time like that. You want to try to keep squirrels out of your feeders because they will eat all of the stuff and waste your money. And they probably really don't need it. So you can don't do anything that's going to be harmful to the squirrels, but you can get these really nice baffles that go around the pole or the base of your feeder. You can also get feeders that are made with like a little lever that a heavier animal will trigger, and that will close the feeder so they can't get to the seed. And birds are too light to trigger that, so when the bird lands on it, they can get at the seed, but a squirrel or other animal would not be able to do that. Providing bird baths is also great. And if you live in an apartment and you can't have like a seed feeder because maybe you're on a balcony and there's someone below you, or, your management company says, no, it's going to attract rats or whatever, which it very well could. So that is a point. Having a bird bath and or hummingbird feeders is a great way to be able to interact with birds without having a seed feeder. And same as for the bird feeders, you want to make sure that you're cleaning bird baths very frequently. So, birds will get in there and bathe and drink and all of that, and they'll make a mess of it. But it's one of the best things in life is watching a bird take a bath. So I highly recommend having bird baths and having that fresh water, especially during the summer or in the winter when a lot of the water sources are frozen. If you live in a pretty cold area, having a bird bath that has a little heater in it can be amazing for the wildlife to make sure that they have plenty of water to drink and bathe in. Keeping their feathers clean is super, super important. And especially during wet weather, they need to keep their feathers really clean in order to maintain their waterproofing so that when they get rained on, the water rolls off like off a duck's back or a songbird's back. It's very important for them to be able to keep their feathers clean and well groomed. So having access to a bath is wonderful for birds. And those water sources can be wonderful during hot, dry weather for other animals too. I know the deer in my yard, I often catch drinking out of my bird baths. So that is also another reason, though, to make sure that they're kept very clean, because we don't want different species to be sharing their flora with each other, because sometimes what one species is adapted to as normal flora can be harmful to another species. So again, keeping things very clean is very important when we're trying to be helpful to our wildlife and not cause them more problems. Of course, one of the downsides of having seed around and attracting birds is we can inadvertently attract other wildlife. So I did mention rodents a little bit there. I love the squirrels and chipmunks coming by, and I actually will kind of spill a little of my bird seed on purpose just to give them a little treat. But I do have baffles up to keep them from getting into the feeders. And we do definitely have a lot of wildlife that can come into our yards and hang out around our homes that we may not really want hanging around our homes. So I do want to talk about handling some of the wildlife interactions that are maybe not so charming. So keep in mind that what we might consider a nuisance behavior is a normal, natural behavior for that animal. Try not to hate them for it. I know how frustrating it can be to have animals do stuff to your home or in your home that you did not want, but usually they were there in that environment long before we were and doing their own thing, and we showed up with a bunch of really attractive stuff that they now want to enjoy as well. And we also tend to do a lot of damage to their habitats and make it harder for them to make a living. So if we do something like have accessible trash outside that has food in it, we're probably going to have raccoons and potentially skunks and other animals get into it. If we plant really tasty, delicious plants around our homes, wonderful roses or vegetable gardens and things like that, deer and rabbits and rodents are probably going to want to get in on that action. So I live in an area with a lot of deer and I love the deer, but they also make me crazy because I've had to put fences around everything. So they also have gotten into my bird feeders. So I had to build my wonderful husband had to build for me a bird feeding station that was tall enough that the deer couldn't stretch up and get into the bird feeders and eat all of the seed in one go. So I completely understand the downsides of wildlife sharing our spaces, but I do want to talk to you about some humane approaches to trying to minimize the damage that animals can do. We have woodpeckers that will peck on our chimney. On the metal part. They do this in the springtime because it's really loud and wonderful. And it's a great way to let a potential mate know that you're there. So they're just doing their normal natural thing, but it's so loud all of a sudden, and it's always first thing in the morning. And the sunrise up here in the Pacific Northwest in the springtime is really early. So the woodpeckers are ridiculous and they drive me crazy in the springtime, but it also makes me laugh really hard every time they do it. So it's okay. But sometimes woodpeckers are actually trying to peck a hole in the siding of your house. That's no fun. Birds also, if they're trying to nest around your house or they're hanging out, perching on a spot on your house, and then they're leaving their droppings all over the place, all of those kinds of things. Skunks moving in under your deck, mice getting into the house, all of those things can be pretty unpleasant interactions with wildlife. So firstly, be aware, a lot of these animal species are protected by various federal laws or state regulations. So be aware of those before you take any kind of action to deal with animals around your house. In general, if you're just trying to deter animals in a humane way from getting around your home, that's not going to be violating any laws. But if you're thinking about doing some kind of trapping or hunting or anything like that, you do need to be aware of laws. And also, I don't recommend doing that because I prefer that animals are unharmed, of course. So I strongly, strongly recommend that you avoid using any kind of snap traps, glue traps, or poison, partly because these are completely non-selective, so you often will be harming animals you did not intend to harm. So any of those traps can catch the wrong animal or hurt the wrong animal. Poisons in particular, if a little mouse or rat eats the poison, they're sick, and then they get caught by a predator like a hawk or an owl. That hawk or owl often will die from the poison as well. And that's kind of horrible, not only for the two animals that suffered from being poisoned, but also you just killed a predator who would have eaten a whole lot more mice and rats that would then not have gotten into your house. So if we start taking down the predators in the area, we're going to have more of a problem with rodents getting into the home. So I definitely, please avoid poisons. Glue traps and snap traps, of course, can ensnare any animal, and they are very slow to kill. Snap traps often do not kill immediately, but both of those devices cause a lot of suffering for the animal. So they're horrible, horrible things to use. I would love for people to stop using them. There are other things that we can do. So the first one, of course, is trying to prevent attracting wildlife and preventing access to your home. So secure your trash. If you're getting raccoons or opossums or anybody into your trash, you can get locking trash
cans and that sort of thing, lids that they cannot get off and that kind of stuff. So make it inaccessible to those animals. Keep in mind, they have little hands. So they just having like a plastic lid on your trash can is not going to keep a raccoon or an opossum out. So you do need to have one that has some kind of a locking mechanism. If you have any little entry points that little rodents or creatures are getting in through, try to identify those. If you don't know where they are, you can use flour or cornstarch around kind of like the outside. Like if you think there's a gap in the garage door or something like that where they're getting in, sprinkle flour around like at dusk, and then come out in the morning and see if you can find some little footy prints in there, and that might show you where they're getting in and out. And then you can use like steel wool to stuff little entry points, or in whatever other way you need to close that off, you can seal that entry point. So just keeping them from getting into your home firstly is really helpful, but it does sometimes take a little detective work to figure out how they're getting in. And if you have, a compost, make sure that it's either not accessible for animals to get into, or it's far enough away from your home. If you have a really big yard, put it, down the hill so they're not getting into your home if they get into the compost. If you've got fruit trees and there's fruit falling, you want to try to clean that up regularly so that, it's not an attractant for animals to then come up even closer to your house. If you have pets that have outdoor access, don't feed them outside, because you will absolutely attract every other animal that thinks that cat food or dog food is tasty. So don't feed them outdoors. If you have an enclosed, like a dog run or a catio, you might be able to get away with that. But depending on the size of your fencing, mice can probably still get in. So if you're concerned about attracting mice, I wouldn't feed any other animals outdoors, because mice can just they can get into like a half-inch gap. So they're just so tiny, they can squeeze into such a small space. They're probably going to be able to get into any kind of dog run or catio. If you have pet doors, you can get chip-activated, like microchip-activated doors, so they won't open for other animals if you're finding that other creatures are getting into your home through a pet door. So that's one way to help prevent their access. And then for animals that are getting into like your garden, your plants, that sort of thing, you probably are going to need to use fencing or cages around the plants. I consider this an excuse to get cute little fencing kind of stuff around my plants. Although I did have to just build a fence around my veggie garden because the deer would eat absolutely everything. So you can choose varieties of plants if you're doing landscaping, that sort of thing, that are so-called deer-proof, or that, rabbits and other creatures don't like to eat. Good luck with that. I've planted so many plants that are supposedly deer-proof that within a week the deer have mowed down to stubs. So I found that physical deterrents are the best. So using some kind of fencing, making it inaccessible to deer and bunnies. Yeah, I haven't found that any of the tricks of using something that doesn't taste good have worked at all in my area. I think I might just have crazy deer because they've even eaten like my onions and mustard and stuff like that, which deer are not supposed to like to eat, but my deer do. There's some people that say that Irish Spring, the soap kind of shaved off over the plants, will keep deer out of it. I haven't found that to work either, and I've also gotten these little soap things that are supposed to deter deer. I also have not found that to work. So for me, it's fencing all the way, but cute little fencing, that's ideal. So now if you've done all that you can do to deter, but you're still getting animals that are causing some issues, and you need to use something that's a little bit of a stronger deterrent, you can get some motion activated stuff. There's one that's an air can that does a high pressure spray. So as the animal walks in front of it, it makes a loud noise that's scary to them, and then it shoots air out. So it's not harmful to the animal, but it scares them. And that can help deter them from coming back around if they're coming to a certain area. This is one that I will use also for stray cats that are coming up to your window and screaming at your cats inside, which, not that I have any personal experience with that, but it's that little air can. It makes a meep, like loud noise, and then that psh of air, and it scares them away, so they stop coming around that area. There also are some that you can hook up to a water faucet, and that they might spray water. And so those are, relatively harmless to the animal, but they can freak the animal out enough that they decide, ooh, that house is scary, I'm not going back over there. So that's another kind of next level deterrent that can be helpful. Sometimes just the noise alone will be helpful enough to keep them from coming back to that area. It depends on the animal. Some of them will learn that nothing bad actually happens to them, and they'll just start ignoring it. So that those devices don't always work, but sometimes they work. They're quite effective if the animal is annoyed or freaked out by it enough that they decide they don't want to go back to that area. If you get wasp nests and you're getting kind of potentially scary, stingy animals in your area. If you see a wasp nest that's starting to be built, try to knock it down while it's still small, and keep that area sort of unpleasant for the wasps so that they hopefully decide to go elsewhere. There are some fake nests, wasp nests that you can buy to hang up that might deter certain types of wasps, because they often won't build a nest if there are already wasps nesting in the area. It depends on the species, whether or not that might work. It's certainly worth a try. It's not going to hurt anything to try. But if you can see they're starting to make a nest, knock it down, and then you can spray a peppermint spray in that area. They tend to really hate the peppermint spray and probably will not come back to that area. Keep in mind, a lot of wasp species are pretty docile. I actually have paper wasps nesting in my greenhouse, and I just let them do it because they mostly make their nests up at the very top, and they don't bother me at all. They fly around in there. They're doing their thing. I ignore them. They ignore me, and that's fine. I did have yellow jackets nest in my greenhouse, and that was a completely different story because they wanted to attack me the moment I came near my greenhouse, which was not as fun. I had to remove that nest. We don't want people getting stung, but also keep in mind bees are a completely different story, and bees are extremely unlikely to sting you except for a couple of species. And if you live in an area with those, you probably already know because you've probably already been stung, unfortunately. But most bees, bumblebees especially, usually are not going to sting you unless you're like smushing them or they feel very, very threatened, because of course stinging them rips the stinger out of their body and kills them. So they're not likely to sting unless they feel like they are very, very threatened. So we don't, if you've got flowers and that sort of thing, you're going to be attracting bees and wasps as pollinators, which is wonderful. So if you can coexist with them and they're not causing you any imminent danger, if you can just leave them alone, they usually will just leave you alone. Now, if you do have animals that are coming into your house, like you've got a mouse infestation in your garage and they're trying to get into your house, anything like that, and you really do need to get rid of them, and you're trying to avoid something like a snap trap or a trap that's going to kill them. There are humane traps that are live traps that you can get from, a lot of times you can get them from like a hardware store. You can find them online. If it's a larger animal, you can talk with your local humane society or animal control, and they may have humane traps that you can borrow or rent for a larger animal. Now, if you're talking about a larger animal like a raccoon or something like that, you do need to check on local regulations as far as if you're allowed to trap and relocate, because you may not be. For small animals like mice and rats, usually it's okay. And if you get these little humane traps, and I have had to do this with mice in my garage, you load the little trap and you must check it daily. I set an alarm when I have any of these set for the mice in my garage to check it daily, because otherwise you'll have little animals starving to death in there, and that is no better than having used a snap trap or a glue trap. So make sure that you're checking it daily for having a little creature in there. And then if you're relocating them, you need to take it like 2 miles away, and don't release them in somebody else's yard. Try to release them in some kind of a wild park sort of situation or something where they can go and live a normal, natural life. If you release them close, like a half mile from your house, they will probably find their way back. because they can use scent and all kinds of things to find their way back, which is, I have actually had them do that. So they are pretty crafty little creatures. So you do need to relocate them somewhere far away. But do check on local regulations before you engage in any trapping and relocating. And if that is against local regulations, it means that there may be people who have a license to do it. So a wildlife-friendly pest control company might be someone that you could work with to try to take care of more of an issue. Or if you're like freaked out by mice or rats, like my sister, and you jump on the table and scream, which makes me laugh really hard, then you might want to work with a pest control company. But do try to make sure that they are a wildlife-friendly company that uses humane practices before you go and hire somebody to take care of a pest situation around the house. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about birds doing annoying things on and around your home. There are a few things that you can do to try to deter birds from hanging out around your house or doing damage to your home. So a lot of you, I'm sure probably everyone has seen these owl decoys that are sitting on top of a building. And you may, like me, have seen pigeons sitting right on top of the head of that owl. So those static decoys usually don't work. They may work for a while, but generally birds are quite smart and will figure out that that thing is not a real bird. So it might look pretty convincing initially, but they will realize that it's not moving around and it's just not real, and then they will not be deterred by it anymore. Now, you can get some movable decoys, either ones that you can like position the head and change it every couple of days, or probably more useful are ones that have like a wing that moves around, or the whole thing kind of moves around. That probably would be more effective for a longer period of time, and especially if you also kind of move its position around the house every so often so that the birds are a little uncertain of it. That might work better. And also like wind spinners, streamers, especially if they have some reflective material, things that are moving around in the area where the birds are coming to the house to try to do damaging things. That kind of movement, especially things that will move kind of suddenly, and things that are reflective and shiny, those can be more upsetting to birds and make the area less attractive for them to want to hang out in. So I would recommend using something like that that's moving to give you better potential success at deterring the birds. You also, if it's an option, installing like metal flashing, that kind of thing. If you're having woodpeckers that are trying to peck into your siding, that could be helpful. But also be aware, sometimes if woodpeckers are trying to dig into your house, it may be because they are trying to forage, because you may actually have some insect damage in the wood if you have wood siding or wood trim. So if there's insect damage, they may actually be getting in there after the insect. So do inspect any area that birds, especially woodpeckers, are damaging around your home to see if they actually are giving you a signal that you've got some rotting wood with insect damage that actually really needs to be replaced. And then replacing that often will solve the problem. And especially if you can, if it's a possibility to replace it with like a composite that's mixed with cement or something like that, that's not going to be as easy or as interesting for them to try to dig into. But definitely check out any areas that woodpeckers have started paying attention to, because they may actually be trying to forage there versus trying to make a nest cavity, which is another reason that they might be doing damage to your home. There's the bird netting stuff that you can get if you do opt to use bird netting to prevent birds from having access, like up under eaves or something like that. Make sure that you put it in so it's nice and tight, so it's not loose and flappy, because then birds could potentially get stuck in it, and we definitely don't want that. If it's nice and tight and they just it's just a barrier and they can't really get around it, it should not be harmful in any way. Which we certainly want to make sure that we're doing it in a safe way to protect the birds. We don't want them damaging our homes, but we also don't want to be damaging them, hopefully. Another way to kind of deter birds from getting into your stuff is to give them some of their own stuff in your near surround. So providing nesting sites, so especially for woodpeckers and such that are cavity nesters, often most of those species will take very happily to a nest box that you provide. So if you have good spots where you can add some nest boxes that are more attractive than your house, because the hole is already made, it's nice and easy. Most birds are going to take the easy way out. So if you provide them with something that's even better than the side of your house, they probably will like that. And also, if they are trying to forage on your house, then providing some food options, peanut feeders, suet feeders. Suet feeders also often can be nice and easy because you can just hang them out as they are, and you don't have to have really any kind of bird feeder that you have to be cleaning and keeping up regularly. So that can be a nice, easy way to send woodpeckers to a different spot away from your house. I would avoid ultrasonic like noisemakers because they can be extremely irritating to a lot of other animals, including dogs. So if you have dogs, you definitely don't want to use that. Bats, all kinds of other animals could be actually sort of damaged by those ultrasonic like plug-in noisemakers that are supposed to be animal repellents. Those are really irritating. So I would try to avoid using anything like that. So coexisting with our wildlife whenever possible, making sure that we're abiding by wildlife laws and regulations and that we're protecting the animals as much as we can while still protecting our homes is really important. We want to try to not do more harm than good. It can be frustrating when we have sort of nuisance behavior going on, but it's important to understand that there are a lot of steps that we can take before jumping to something like a trap or a poison. So on the flip side of that, let's talk about what to do if you find an injured or orphaned wild animal that you want to help. If you live in an area that has animals, you probably will come across an injured or possibly orphaned baby wild animal at some point. And that can be a horrible thing to witness, seeing an animal that's suffering, injured, and not knowing what to do. But there are things that we can do. And you always want to keep in mind your own safety. So be very careful if you're approaching any kind of wild animal, even one that seems relatively harmless or docile, like a deer. They can kick you in the face. So be very, very careful if you're approaching, a raccoon or a bird of prey that has big, scary talons. You do want to make sure that you have some instruction from a wildlife professional of some kind before you do that. So if you can call either your state wildlife department or the closest wildlife rehabilitation center. So if you're not familiar with rehabilitation centers, these are usually nonprofit private organizations, although occasionally they are attached to like a county humane society or animal shelter. So sometimes those are kind of combined, but most of the time it's a separate nonprofit organization that's largely running on volunteers most of the time. And they are licensed by usually the state to work with wild animals, native wild animals. So they will take injured and orphaned animals and in kind of more specialty cases, animals that have been affected by oil spills, which is one of the things I used to do, take care of them, treat their illness, hopefully treat their injuries, and get them rehabilitated back to the point where they're healthy enough to be re-released to the wild. And these people have a lot of training on how to appropriately handle these animals to minimize their stress, to prevent them from becoming habituated to humans, which we really don't want. We don't want to turn them into pets. That's not good for them, especially if we want to re-release them back to the wild. They're trained on the appropriate nutrition for each species, how to get that food into them if they're debilitated, how to provide physical therapy if there's been like a broken wing or something like that, how to medicate them properly, and how to get them conditioned to get back into the wild. So most of these facilities have kind of various stages of an indoor hospital and then outdoor caging and then larger areas. Sometimes they've got setups with trees and things like that, or they've got long flight aviaries for larger birds to start really exercising again before they get back out into the wild, and they know how to test them to make sure that they're okay and ready to be released. So don't be tempted to take a wild animal into your home and try to rehabilitate them yourself. So while the intention, of course, is always to be helpful and try to save a life, oftentimes in our desire to do something good, we end up doing more harm than good if we don't know how to do it properly. And it's very easy to turn certain wild animals into very friendly sort of pet animals, which we really should not be doing. And also, importantly, there are federal laws that protect most of our native birds, and mostly there are more state regulations protecting mammals and reptiles that make it actually illegal for you to have them in your home. It does depend on what state you're living in. There are some states where like it's fine to have a pet raccoon, and other states where that's completely illegal. But most of our birds are protected by federal law, and that's not so variable state to state. If you're outside of the country, of course, I don't know what the laws are if you're outside of the U.S. So you would just need to check with your local area, what's legal and what's not. But there are wildlife rehabilitation facilities all over the world. If you're in a very rural area, you may not have access to one. So it may be a matter of getting in touch with your whatever your local wildlife agency is and asking, what kind of help is there for this animal that I've found that was hit by a car, or you just found a sick animal lying on the ground, or there's been an oil spill or something horrible like that. You can usually look online and find what facility there is in your area. You can, with the AI that we have now on our search engines, you can say, I've just found an injured animal. What do I do? And they can kind of guide you through. And if it is a potentially dangerous animal, they may have someone who can come out and help if you can kind of stay in the area and make sure that the animal is still there and hasn't disappeared. You do have to keep in mind, because these facilities are often staffed entirely by volunteers, they're usually understaffed, and they often don't have someone who can come out and catch the animal. It depends on the area, and it depends on how well staffed they are. Sometimes they have someone who can at least come out and help, but they really can't afford to have people going out on wild goose chases when the animal might be gone completely by the time they get there, and then they can't find them. And they don't have the staffing to be able to do that. So first rule, really watch the animal before you intervene and make sure they actually are injured and need help. Sometimes with baby animals, they're temporarily unattended while the parents are out foraging or hunting. And they may not be orphaned and they may not be injured. So if you find like a fawn, little baby deer sleeping in tall grass, it's totally normal for the fawn to be alone for several hours while mom is out eating and making milk before she comes back. The mama deer will come back and nurse like a couple times a day. She doesn't spend hours and hours a day with the fawns when they're very young. So if the fawn is just sleeping quietly and seems comfortable, they're probably fine. If they're walking around your yard crying, a little tiny baby fawn, then that is not normal, and probably they have lost their mom. Same with like little fledgling birds. When they first start fledging, they don't have the muscle yet to be flying for most species of small birds. So they'll start hopping out of the nest and moving around, and they'll end up on the ground, and they can't quite get back up into a tree. They might be able to hop into a bush, but they're not flying yet. It doesn't mean they have a broken wing. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with them. If they're hopping around and they look bright and perky, and there's not a one wing hanging, they probably don't have a broken wing. Often at a wildlife facility, we'll get these baby birds in because someone thinks they have a broken wing because they're hopping around on the ground. But they are totally fine. And they probably would be better just staying where they are because mom and dad are still feeding them. So you can watch if you have a baby, if you can keep an eye on them for a while and see what they're doing. If you see parents coming down and feeding them and the baby's hopping around and really perky and they don't look lopsided in any way, they don't look, one wing is hanging much lower than another or something like that, which would be a signal that there probably is an injury to the wing. If they're not doing that, they're probably fine, and you should leave them alone. And try to keep if you have dogs and cats, try to keep them out of the area for a few days. Usually within about 3 or 4 days, those little babies they have built up their muscle and they've started flying. If you do have a bird's nest that has come down, or babies that have fallen, or maybe the nest was attacked by another animal and the babies are out of the nest, but they didn't get eaten. They may be injured from the fall. They may be injured from a predator having, grabbed them and then dropped them. You can pick baby birds up. Most birds don't have much of a sense of smell, so the whole idea of you can't touch them because then the parents will reject them, that is a myth. That's not true for birds at all. For some mammals, it can be, so you do have to be more careful with baby mammals. But for baby birds, little songbirds that have fallen from a nest, you can touch them. I don't recommend handling them a lot. Of course, it's a wild animal. You don't want to be cuddling them. But you can pick them up and check them for injuries. So if you see bleeding or if the baby looks very lethargic, they're not moving around very much. If their skin looks really kind of papery and wrinkly, they may be very dehydrated. If they're cold to the touch, any of that kind of thing, they need care immediately. But if they're perky and they pop up and they're lifting their little heads up and they're maybe going, asking for food, they probably are fine. And if you don't see any signs of injury, no blood or, obvious wounds or anything like that, you can just put the nest back and put the babies back in it. And that's really the best thing to do. If the babies are not clearly injured or sick, the best thing to do is to get them back in the nest so that the parents can come and take care of them. And if you can monitor for the next few hours and just make sure the parents are coming back, that's ideal. If the nest has been totally destroyed or it's in a really bad spot, you can make a false nest using like a shoebox or something and put some paper towels and things, or maybe if you can find part of the nest material, put that in a box and then nail it to a tree in a good spot that's protected and that's a safe spot as close as possible to the original nest if you can figure out where that was. And then again, watch and see if the parents are coming and feeding the babies. And which hopefully they will be. And if they're not, if parents don't come back, they seem to not be able to find the babies for some reason, then you may need to take them in to be cared for. So in general, that those same signs of obvious injury, bleeding, an obvious wound, an animal that looks like they're kind of basically unconscious or can't get up on their own. If you have an animal that was caught by your cat or dog and is probably wounded, not moving around normally, or you have baby where you're sure that the parents are not around, these are all things that mean, yes, it would be great if you could intervene, if you can. And again, recognizing a broken wing versus a branch or baby, you're looking for that one wing kind of being lower down than the other, and maybe the tip is dragging on the ground. Or if the bird is flapping, they go to flap and only one wing is really doing the full flap and the other one looks like it's kind of just flopping around. That's a broken wing. And again, if you're not sure how to handle the animal, you want to call one of your local facilities to ask for some guidance on what to do. If it's an animal that has talons or teeth, you really want to be wearing thick leather gloves and try to get them straight into a carrier. Throw a towel over them and try to, get them moved into some kind of a ideally hard-shelled carrier or a cardboard box that you can then close up. You want to minimize any talking or handling of the animal. Don't try to pet them or comfort them. Wild animals are not comforted by humans interacting with them. In general, a wild animal might get very quiet. I've heard people say, I petted them the whole way here and they were so quiet, they were really comforted. They probably were not comforted, they were terrified because they're being touched by what they see as a predator. They are not used to being handled by some other huge animal. So that's very scary for a wild animal and very, very stressful. So touching them, talking to them, any of that should be minimized. You want to get them into a carrier or box and have them in a kind of dark, quiet place and try to get them to a wildlife facility as quickly as you can. In general, you don't want to try to put in water or food, because if it's a debilitated animal and you put a dish of water in there, they might actually, especially if they're small, they might fall into it or, get their face in there, potentially can drown in a small dish of water, especially a baby bird or something like that. So that's the basics of what to do if you find an injured or orphaned wild animal. Be safe. Watch out for your own safety, and remember to treat them as wild animals and not cute little adorable cartoon creatures that want to interact with you, because for the most part, unfortunately, they don't want to interact with us unless they are healthy and whole and we are offering them some kind of food out in the wild. So feeding birds, sometimes they might get kind of close to you when you're coming out to change your feeders and that sort of thing. But we want to minimize that more close interaction, and we definitely don't want to be trying to hand feed wild animals and that sort of thing, that really puts them more in harm's way, because they may end up approaching people who do not want to be approached, and they may end up in danger because of that. So try to not habituate the wild animals around you. Try not to give in to the temptation to be more friendly and cuddly with them or turn them into some kind of pets, because they really they're wild and free, and they should get to live that way without putting themselves in danger by being too closely associated with human activities, because not all humans are going to be friendly and nice to those animals. So I do also want to talk about keeping your pets safe around wildlife, because wildlife exposure with our animals who are our pets can be very risky for them in a variety of different ways. So there are a lot of animals out there that are predators who will see our smaller dogs and cats, our bunnies, our pet birds as prey. I have unfortunately had a hawk fly right into my window next to where my birds hang out, my little parrots. And thankfully the Cooper's hawk was fine after hitting my window and flew off and looked totally fine. And that's when I put some stickers on my window so that they could see the window. It was shortly after I moved into this house. But they saw my little birds and were like, that looks yummy, I'm going to eat that. So in the area where I live, we have coyotes, we have hawks, eagles, owls, bobcats, snakes. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff around here. So it's really not a safe place for small mammals to be wandering around. So that's why my kitties have a catio. I highly, highly recommend, if you have cats, that you have a catio if you can. That's a great way to protect your cat and also protect the wildlife. So that way your cat can enjoy the enrichment of being outdoors, doing a little bird watching, enjoying the sunshine and the fresh air. And just watching all the wildlife out there and sniffing everything, but they're not going to be at risk of getting predated on. And the small birds, the songbirds, wherever you live, are not at risk of your cat killing them, which is a huge problem. Cats around the world kill hundreds of thousands of small birds a year, and they generally are not eating them. They're not hunting them to live. These are pet cats that are well fed, that are just having fun. They're doing what they evolved to do, and they have a drive to hunt and catch small birds and mice and other little creatures. So it's normal behavior for the kitty, but we really don't want them doing that when we are supporting them with all the good food and healthcare and everything that they get living in our homes. It's really an unfair advantage, and they don't need to be eating songbirds in particular. So catios or harness walking for cats is a great way to help protect the cat while still giving them enrichment. And similar for dogs, dogs can have if you can build kind of a dog run so that your dog can be out, sort of unsupervised in the yard, but still protected from coyotes and that kind of thing. That's ideal. There also are these coyote roller devices that you can put on a fence. So it's like a bar that will roll if you have a fence and the coyote tries to get over your fence into your yard. It makes it very difficult for the coyote to get over the fence. It also makes it harder for your dogs to get out of the yard. Cats, probably it helps, but cats are so lithe and limber, they can get around a lot of that kind of stuff. But the coyote roller fencing can be helpful, because just a regular, even like a 6 or 8 foot fence, coyote probably can get over that. It's a bobcat as well, probably can get over that. So installing some kind of protective fencing can be helpful. If you have like pet chickens or bunnies or anybody, even like pygmy goats that you're keeping outside, they're housed outdoors. You want to make sure that your housing is very predator-proof as well. So you need to dig in chicken wire or galvanized hardware cloth, ideally 2 feet deep around the base of their housing. You can't just have like a floor, because the coyotes and foxes and all kinds of other creatures, raccoons, they can dig in underneath. So you do want to make sure that you've got that protective metal a couple feet deep around the whole perimeter of their housing, and ideally in an L shape, so it goes down and then it goes under a little bit. So even if they dig down deep enough, which is unlikely that they're going to dig that deep, but if they manage to dig that deep down, then you still have that L shape. So they will have a really hard time getting around that. And you want to make sure too you have overhead coverage so that owls and raccoons who climb super easily can't just climb up the side and get in through the top. So you want to make sure the top is covered as well for any animals that you're housing outdoors. And that goes for if you do have a dog run or a catio, you want to make sure the top is covered for sure. If you're taking animals on hikes with you, definitely want to make sure you keep them on a leash. I know a lot of people love to let their dogs run loose, and if you have a large dog, they're probably pretty safe. But if there is a coyote nearby or something, there is a risk that they could get in a fight. So even a large dog can sustain some pretty serious injuries from a fight with a wild animal. Even a raccoon, a 20-pound raccoon can do a lot of damage, even to a large dog. And unfortunately, I've seen many of these happen, and it's very scary for the dog too. Your dog is not expecting to get attacked like that. But if you have a small dog or you're hiking with your cat or something, you definitely want to make sure to keep them on leash, because if they take off running after something exciting that they see, they are little prey animals. Even though they're also scary little predators, they are prey animals, and they would be at high risk for getting predated on. Likewise, if you have a bird that you take out, that you go on hikes or whatever, highly also recommend that they be on in a flight suit, a little birdie harness on a leash. So that one, if they get startled, they don't just fly off and get lost, because when they're panicked, they can easily get lost and disappear on you. And also, I have heard more than one story of a Cooper's hawk or similar little hawk coming down and taking a bird right off of somebody's shoulder. So you want to have them on a leash as well. Now, if you free fly your birds and you have made your peace with that, the possibility that they could get attacked by a native predatory bird, as long as you've made your peace with that, it can happen. So if you are free flying your birds, they definitely are at risk, and it does happen, sadly, that a parrot that's out having a fun flight around gets grabbed by a predator bird. Because our predatory birds are incredible athletes, and some of them specialize in catching other birds. So be very aware of that if you're making the decision to take your birds out as well. Another aspect of potential injury or illness in regard to contact with wildlife is infectious diseases and parasites. So rabies in particular is, of course, a huge one. Rabies is 100% fatal if you get it and you're not pre-vaccinated. So you absolutely want to make sure that your animals are vaccinated against rabies. And in most of the U.S., that is a state requirement. So it is a state law that you have your dog or cat vaccinated regularly against rabies. Elsewhere in the world, it varies. Some areas don't have any rabies, which is awesome, and then you don't need to worry about that. But in the U.S., we definitely do have rabies. Skunks, raccoons, bats, lots of other mammals carry rabies. If you're on the West Coast, bats are the kind of highest risk. If you're on the East Coast, I believe it's more skunks. So there are quite a few mammals. Opossums are somewhat resistant to rabies, so they are a lower risk animal. But if you think that your animal has had contact with any of those other mammals, there is a risk of that animal having had rabies. And especially if an animal has kind of come into your home, or like you have a barn and a wild animal comes in there and is like actively attacking, I would be very worried that they have rabies, because that's a rare thing for a wild animal. If you're in the vicinity, a wild animal usually is going to run away because they will see you as the bigger predator. So if you get attacked by a wild animal, you definitely want to go to the hospital, and you want to get a rabies exposure vaccine. But keeping your dogs and cats protected with a rabies vaccine is hugely important. Those vaccines are highly protective and life-saving, and rabies is transmissible to you. So it is really important to make sure that you're both protected. This goes even for indoor cats. Unfortunately, bats can get in your house. And I have known many people who have woken up to a weird noise and discovered that there was a bat in the house that their cats were chasing around. And they had no idea how the bat got in, but bats can crawl into a space about an inch wide. So any little gap, they can manage to find their way in. So it is important, even for indoor kitties and dogs that don't spend a lot of time outside. If you have a little itty bitty dog who just kind of goes out to potty and doesn't spend a lot of time outside, there still is that risk. And a little flying bat flying around your house in a panic because they're stuck inside your house is super easy prey and very exciting for a cat or even, dogs that have a big prey drive. They are going to try to catch that bat. And there is a risk if the bat has rabies that now all of your whole family is at risk. So if you do find a bat in your house, you want to be very careful about removing the bat from the house. Put gloves on and try to just guide them out an open door. So turn off overhead lights and open a door and try to get them to just go out the door. But if they're like clinging to a wall or something like that, you can kind of use like a broom and a waste bin and try to just gently brush them into the bin and then take them outside. If you think at all that you may have been bitten or your pet has been bitten, you want to go seek medical attention for either or both of you right away. So rabies, of course, is a big scary, and people do unfortunately still get it. Even in today's world, even with all of the vaccines, it does still happen. So make sure that you're protecting your little ones as much as you can. Another bacterial infection that is kind of all over the world is leptospirosis. And this is one, you may have heard of the one that you can get from contaminated water. Mostly it is transferred in contaminated water because it's expelled from the body in the urine. So it's getting into a water source. And that's where animals will tend to get infected as they're swimming around or they're drinking from a puddle of water or something like that. And that's often where they'll get infected with that. So we do have vaccinations against leptospirosis. So if you're in an area where lepto is, a likelihood, which is unfortunately most of the world. But if you live in Hawaii, that's like 50% of all cases of leptospirosis. So if you're in Hawaii, you definitely want to have your dogs vaccinated against lepto. Cats, thankfully, are pretty resistant to leptospirosis. So in general, we don't vaccinate cats against it, just doggies. But that is also a really important one to be careful of. So there are other infectious diseases that wildlife can carry. Some of those are blood-borne diseases, and those are going to be transmitted by insects that suck blood, so generally ticks and mosquitoes. So that's higher risk for pets that are going outdoors, especially ticks. It's rare that we'll get ticks inside our homes, but mosquitoes definitely can get in your home. Mosquitoes carry heartworm disease, and that can infect dogs and cats. They also carry malaria and West Nile virus, which can be deadly for birds. So we want to do whatever we can to minimize mosquitoes around your home. So try to avoid having standing water and that sort of thing where mosquitoes breed. But also your cats and dogs can be protected from heartworm disease with a regular parasite preventive, usually monthly, although there are some other options that are longer lasting. And then for the other bloodborne diseases, it's ticks and fleas that are going to transmit those. There is one very nasty one that fleas can give to cats. So I recommend that you don't wait until you're seeing evidence of fleas, that you treat year-round with a parasite preventive that will prevent fleas and ticks, and also ideally intestinal parasites and heartworm disease. There are now a lot of parasite preventives on the market that are, in general, for 98% of animals, they're very, very safe. There is the occasional animal that will have an adverse reaction, so it is important to be careful whenever you're starting a pet on a parasite preventive and monitor them closely. You also might consider talking with your vet about MDR1 testing for your dogs or cats. The MDR1 gene is involved in metabolism of many different types of drugs. And if you are an individual who has a mutation in that gene, it can alter the way that you metabolize drugs, and you can be at higher risk for having a serious adverse reaction. And that does occur in dogs and cats. Certain breeds of dogs are at higher risk for that. It's just more prevalent in certain breeds. But it can happen in any breed of dog or cat. It's very rare in cats, but it's pretty easy to test for. You can even do the test at home. You can collect a swab from inside the mouth and send it out to Washington State University. You can get on their website and look for that MDR1 testing if you're interested in doing that, because it can affect not just their parasite prevention, but lots of other drugs that we might use. So knowing their status is helpful. Anyway, that's a bit of an aside. But parasite prevention, definitely very important. And fecal testing, at least once a year for animals that are going outdoors, is really important to make sure that they haven't managed to pick up something from some of those creatures out in the wild. And they don't need to have direct contact with a wild animal in order to get most of these diseases, because these can be sort of left, dropped about in the environment. So if you have a kitty outside that's nibbling on grass or something, they sometimes can pick up parasite eggs that then can infect their GI tract and that sort of thing, just because they've been out in the world kind of in contact with stuff. Sometimes it's even, dogs or cats are stepping on stuff outside, and then they come in and they groom their feet, and they've got stuff from the soil in their feet, and then they ingest it, and then that's how they can get infected with intestinal parasites. Even indoors, if they catch a bug, eat a bug, there's potentially that bug was carrying eggs of some parasite that they now can be infected with. So helpful to have them on a regular preventive and not wait until you see evidence of a parasite, because once that has happened, there's also the possibility that they've transmitted some other disease to your pet. Now, we've talked, if you listen to the basic cat, the basic bird, the basic dog, you've already gotten a lot of that parasite information. So I apologize if it's extra, but it's always good to hear stuff more than once to kind of get it ingrained in your memory.
So lastly, I want to talk a bit about just being a good steward of the land. So this beautiful planet that we live on is so full of wonderful creatures and lovely plants and all kinds of life. And we get the benefit of all of that beauty and wonder anytime we choose to go out and enjoy it. And as we talked about earlier, it's so good for our mental and physical health to go out and enjoy it. And I think it's important for us to give back to it and support it and keep it healthy as much as we can. So there are a few things that you can do in your own day-to-day life, around your home and that sort of thing. And that's a little bit beyond just, recycling and trying to minimize waste and minimize your use of single-use plastics and things like that. So those are all important. Trying to buy products that are environmentally safe, doing a little bit of research before you buy your household cleaners and that sort of thing. There's certainly that as an everyday thing that you can do to support the environment. But there's some stuff that's maybe a little bit more hands-on to think about as far as being a good steward of the land around your home. And especially if you have a house and you have some yard where you can do a little bit of gardening and that sort of thing, you have a little bit more variability in what you can do. If you live in an apartment or you just have a small area without much of a yard, you still can put some native plants out. If you have a little balcony or a window box, even something like that, it's a great way to attract and support native birds and butterflies and bumblebees and all these kinds of wonderful creatures that are incredibly important to our whole ecosystem. So planting native plants is one of the great things that you can do for all of your pollinators. So hummingbirds and butterflies and all that love native flowers. So through the spring, summer, fall, you can get online and do a search for what kinds of plants are native to your area. There's a ton of stuff that's really pretty and will grow really well where you live because it's already native there. So it tends to be very easy to take care of. And a lot of the wildflowers that grow naturally in the area where you live will come back year after year. So they can be just wonderful to plant. And if you do a little bit deeper research and find plants that also will produce some fruit and that sort of thing that can attract wildlife that you want to attract and support. It's so much fun to watch. I love watching flocks of birds come to my plants in the spring and summer, and just they get all up in there, and there'll be dozens of birds on a little bush, and they're eating all this stuff, and it's just so much fun to watch them doing their natural thing. And
they're often quite hilarious because they're hanging upside down from branches and things like that. It's just so much fun to watch them. You also want to avoid planting invasive plants. So a lot of the stuff that we find, if you're doing gardening, a lot of the stuff that you'll find in nurseries is not from around here. And that's not necessarily a problem. If it's not a native plant, that's, it's not necessarily harmful, but a lot of those plants are actually invasive, meaning that they will outcompete native plants. So you plant them in your garden and they will spread and take over. And they will actually make it difficult for native plants to continue to live in the area. And this leads to a loss of biodiversity, and it leads to a loss of plants that can be incredibly important to our native species because of specific compounds that those plants produce, or because of these long periods of coevolution where some species of beetle needs this specific plant to lay their eggs, or that, all this kind of stuff. So there's so many interactions that have developed over thousands of years between the plants that grow in an area and the animals that live in that area. So, like monarch butterflies in our area absolutely require milkweed in order to feed their larvae. So they are looking for milkweed specifically. And if there's no milkweed in the area, they can't have their babies grow up. So it's so incredibly important that we keep those native plant populations healthy and strong, and that we minimize the addition of more of these invasive plants. So if you live on the West Coast, especially if you live in the Pacific Northwest, you've probably met some Himalayan blackberry, and it's just the worst. It's so hard to get rid of. And it just will take over acres and acres, and it's just awful. There are lots and lots of those kinds of invasive plants that just knock out everything in their paths. So try to look into what plants you're looking at instead of just planting what's pretty or what you like right now. Try to think a little bit more about, is this potentially invasive? Might this actually be bad for the environment around my home? Is there something better that I can plant that's kind of similar, but that's going to actually provide habitat and food for the native wildlife around my home? Also, try really, really hard to avoid using pesticides, rodenticides, that sort of thing. We talked a little bit already about the poisons and rodenticides that can be risks to other animals like hawks and owls and bobcats and that kind of thing. Pesticides are equally horrible for our native insects. So they don't just get rid of the insects that you don't want. They get rid of all the beneficial insects in the area too. Our bee populations, many of them are threatened, are endangered, and we require bees to make our food. So if we kill off all our bees, we will eventually kill off ourselves as well, because they pollinate massive quantities of our food crops in addition to pollinating all these other wild plants. So we want to protect our bees in particular. Many, many wasp species and even flies are important pollinators too. So avoiding pesticides is incredibly helpful to the tiny wildlife that lives around your home. And it's something to get used to, not using pesticides or chemical fertilizers and all these other kinds of things that can be harmful to the creatures around your home. It does require extra work if you're a gardener to keep your plants healthy and looking good and all that kind of thing, but it's well worth it.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of
be
Dr. A
pesticide free and herbicide free and all that kind of thing, and to have a more natural environment around your home that's really supporting the wildlife and over time producing a healthier habitat.
Patient relationship is formed through
also, if you can avoid using gas-powered equipment around your home, so if you have a lawnmower or something like that, avoiding gas power and trying to use electric equipment is helpful, because we actually dribble quite a lot of gas into our yards when we're using a gas-powered lawnmower or other gas-powered equipment, using a leaf blower, any of that kind of stuff. That gasoline actually leaves a fair bit behind, and that, of course, is very harmful to wildlife. It seeps into the soil, into the groundwater, all that kind of thing. So it's definitely not ideal. I also highly recommend, if you have a lawn, think about converting it to a native plant habitat instead of a lawn. Lawns use a tremendous amount of water, which in a lot of areas is at a premium, especially if you live on the kind of in the Southwest. So avoiding wasting water just to grow a monoculture of grass that doesn't really do much of anything for anyone, aside from being able to sit out there and have a picnic, maybe, play sports, whatever. If you can minimize the amount of lawn that you have around your house and convert that into other types of plantings, you're reducing water use, you're potentially planting native plants that are attracting wonderful, beautiful wildlife and supporting a much healthier environment around your home. Highly recommend doing that. And there are lots of resources. National Wildlife Foundation has some great resources for planting native plants. And actually, Sunset Magazine has lots of great articles on converting your lawn into a beautiful planted garden. So also creating microhabitats for insects and that sort of thing is great. So if you do have a little bit more land and you're trimming stuff and that kind of thing, if you have a corner where you can do a little brush pile where you can leave wood stumps if you're trimming trees and that sort of thing, those are actually really good habitat for insects and other small animals. So of course we don't want to encourage small rodents up close to our homes, but if you have a little bit more space and you can leave brush and trimmed trees and that sort of thing, those are really good places for insects. And that also will then attract birds that eat those insects, which is also wonderful. So leaving wood stumps and that kind of thing is great for woodpeckers and other kinds of birds. If you have really tall trees and you have some dead trees, leaving the dead tree, as long as it's not in an area that's going to be unsafe, like potentially fall on your house, you don't want that, of course. But if it's further from your house and you can leave snags, that's also really important nesting habitat for lots of bird species, and also some squirrels and that kind of thing.
And if any of my neighbors are listening, they now understand fully why my yard is so messy.
Another thing to think about is if you have open containers or other potential traps for wildlife, make sure that you're keeping that stuff safe. So open containers, I try to always turn over so an animal doesn't fall in and get stuck, especially if it's out where it might be collecting water. We don't want to have an animal get trapped in there. So turn stuff upside down, or make sure that there is something in it, like a pole or something that's easy to climb. If an animal gets down in there, they can easily get back out. If you have a fountain or pond, make sure that it's got a little bit of a ramp or rocks in it so that little animals, if they get in there, they can get back out. If you have a pool, same kind of thing. Make sure that you have a way for animals to get out if they fall in there. Frogs and that kind of creature can get in there, and then they realize, it's like a foot to the top and they can't get back out. So make sure that you have some kind of a safe exit for wildlife around your home and that you're not leaving things out and about that might trap them. Also recommend against using landscape netting because snakes can get stuck and entangled in that. Sometimes birds as well. But I've had quite a few snakes come into the wildlife facility that we've had to disentangle that have had lacerations all over their bodies from that nylon netting. Ugh, it's awful. So try to stay away from using that as well. The more that we can be good environmental stewards, the more that becomes commonplace, the more we're protecting the health of our entire environment. And that is going to lead to better mental and physical health for all of us. So it is well worth the effort. I really hope you enjoyed this episode and learned a thing or two. I'd love for you to hit follow or subscribe, listen in for the next episode. Thanks so much for joining me today. And don't hug any wild animals for me, but do tell them I said hi.